Hey BookTube, it's Samantha, and today we're going to be doing a wrap-up for February. And despite it being a really short month, I got a lot of reading done, so I'm just so happy with how things are going. I read a total of 6 books this month, which is crazy, but I got some really good reading in, and it really helped that I enjoyed all the books that I read. So let me talk about them. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the first book that I finished this month, and that is Baby Teeth. And this is a book that I started on audiobook last month and just needed to finish. And I have thoughts. Let's talk about it. So this book is following a 7-year-old girl, not 4, like I said in my previous video, 7-year-old girl named Hannah and her mom Suzette. And Hannah has some issues. It's a little troublesome and a very unhealthy view of her own mom. And we're also following Suzette, mom, and her perspective on things. As the book goes along, she's not exactly handling things as well as she could either. And it's just how they keep going back and forth into what it ultimately builds up to. After I read this book, I actually went back and I watched Kayla's review, that little spoiler part that I mentioned before. And what's interesting is that I think it's because of my background, I had a better understanding of kind of the complexities that were going on. I could see it from different angles, so I found myself enjoying the book more than she did. I actually gave it 4 stars. I'm not going to talk about any spoilers. I don't want to give anything away, but I really enjoyed how it went back and forth, and nothing was necessarily really certain. I used to work with kids and all various ages, specifically a lot of times with kids who have behavioral issues. Now, I don't think I necessarily worked with a kid that was like Hannah, but I have worked with kids who did not like their parents. I think Suzette comes across as any normal person who would have frustrations, and I think part of it is, Hannah's 7 years old, so this has been going on for a while. Hannah's mute, so she's not able to communicate. I could see how it would be really frustrating to work with a child who can't communicate, but it definitely happens. Not all parents, I would even dare say most parents, wouldn't necessarily do the same things that Suzette does to Hannah or says to Hannah in the same situations. Like, it's hard to say without giving it away, but Suzette makes some errors too. And it's just interesting to think about the psychology part behind it, of why they're making the decisions that they're making for both Suzette and Hannah. So I really enjoyed that. The reason why I marked it down a star is because it got to the end and it just didn't feel like the ending that I thought it should have. Yeah, I don't know. It just didn't seem to feel right. It didn't seem to fit. But for the most part, I really did enjoy the book. So if you're one of those people who really likes to think about the psychology of why people make the decisions that they do and how it feeds into the other person, I think you'd really enjoy this book. It's definitely a little bit of body horror, but not too much. The mom suffers from Crohn's disease, so there's some description in there of some of her fears, but for the most part, it's not too bad. I definitely think anyone would be able to read this book. It's not necessarily something that's going to give you nightmares. Unless you have a 7-year-old kid and you're not quite sure what they think of you, but I think that's a very small population out there. Next book I'm going to talk about is the next audiobook that I had listened to and I finished just because it was so short, and that is Murder on the Orient Express. This is a book I can't believe it took me so long to finally read. Unfortunately, I wish that I had just read it with my eyes and not as an audiobook. Because if you follow my Goodreads updates, there was an update that I put in saying that it was really difficult to understand the French accent. For those of you who don't know, Murder on the Orient Express is part of the Poirot series, and he's French. And the narrator does a really good job of the French accent. I would dare say probably a native French speaker, but that in and of itself is kind of the hard part because my ear is not very trained to French speaking, and the French accent of English, it required me to think harder about what the narrator was saying instead of focusing on like the mystery and remembering certain details. I was just trying to understand what he was saying. So I felt like my comprehension probably wasn't as great as it could have been, but I still knew what was going on for the most part. I just had to listen to it at a slow pace. Murder on the Orient Express is one of the more famous books. It's about a murder that is done on a train, and the train was stuck out in the middle of nowhere, so the only way that person could be murdered was if someone on the train had done it. So our detective goes into the case and tries to figure out who killed the person on the train. It was an enjoyable read. It's definitely dated. It has a lot of stereotypes in there, and sometimes it goes to show that stereotypes aren't always true. It does make that point a couple times, but even then, the stereotypes are in there. It's, I think, something that was more maybe modern when it came out, just that it loosely based off of real life events, almost like a Law and Order SVU or just any Law and Order episode where they loosely base an episode off of a real life crime, kind of that same feeling. I did like how the book ended, and in the future I would like to read more, but I'm definitely going to be reading with my eyes rather than audiobook whenever it comes to the Poirot novels. This one, I believe I also gave 4 out of 5 stars. Now, the next 4 books, guys, I'm so proud of myself. I actually read books on my physical shelf. So I've read 4 actual books that I've picked up within, actually, I think since my last book haul. So I got into these books really quick. Next one is Come Tumbling Down by Shauna McGuire. This is the 5th book of the series, and it takes place right after the events of the 2nd book, which, if you watched my video from before, I had mentioned about how this cover is very similar to Among the Six Bones cover, and it was for a reason, because it's taking place right after that book. So we were following some of the characters that I really did enjoy from that book, and we did spend some time in that world in the moors, but it wasn't as much time in the moors as I would have liked. They're in the real world for the first half, and when they're in the real world, it's not eventful. There's not really anything going on. It kind of feels like just trying to catch you up and give you information on like what needs to be done for the second half of the book. And then once we get into the second half of the book, then we're good, and I really, really enjoyed it. But for such a small book to have half of it be not 5-star read that I had, it's not my favorite book. I still prefer the 2nd book over this one. This book, though, I still enjoyed it, so I would give it like 3.5 stars. The next book that I read was Ghoster by Jason Arnott. This book is about a girl who is dating a guy, and he asks her to move in with him. She says yes, of course. But upon getting ready to move out, and then the day of moving in with her boyfriend, she doesn't hear anything from him. And she goes to his apartment with all of her stuff, and there's nothing there. No furniture, no food, no note. But there is his phone. And so she starts looking into his phone to see exactly what happened to him, and things go from there. I really enjoyed this read. This read was very similar to me as reading Grady Hendrix' Horror Store. It was a similar feel, like a similar reading experience that I had. There's some lighthearted moments in there, but it definitely has that horror aspect to it. It's definitely a nod towards how we have a relationship with technology nowadays. I thought it was going to be a lot more of the texting and whatnot, but there was only a little bit of that in here. But still, it was a really fast, quick read. The chapters are so short, which I love when I find a short chapter book, especially when it's big like this, because it makes it go by so much quicker, and I really enjoyed that. It almost gave me the feel of R.L. Stine's books. Like at the end of every Goosebumps chapter, there is this cliffhanger of like, oh my god, what happens next, so that you keep on reading. But unlike R.L. Stine, this has a little more adult feel to it. Usually with Goosebumps, it's like, oh, it's just a cat that ran by, or it's just like the sister who's spooking the person. You know, it resolves itself really quick, but with this, it keeps building on top of itself. It's not going to give you nightmares by any means. This is a book that could be accessible for anyone. It's a really good start into horror, and I really enjoyed this ride. I'm pretty sure I gave this 5 stars. If it's not 5 stars, it's definitely at least 4.5, because I really enjoyed it. So then I took a risk, okay? I knew I was reading books that I really enjoyed, and so I picked up Hounded by Kevin Hearn. This is a book that I knew nothing about, and what's funny is that I thought my brother had recommended this book to my mom, and my mom told me that like it was pretty good, according to my brother. And so I told my brother, I'm like, hey, I picked up this book. And he's like, I haven't read that. So I bought this book thinking that my brother enjoyed it, and so I would enjoy it, but that's not what happened at all. So basically, I picked this book up on a whim. I did like the back cover of it. This is a book about a druid named Atticus O'Sullivan, and he's really, really old. He runs an occult bookshop where he is just trying to lay low, but there is a Celtic god that is trying to get the sword that he picked up a while ago. And so he recruits these individuals that he knows and tries to get rid of this problem once and for all. On the back of the cover, it talks about a goddess of death. It talks about a vampire and werewolf as his lawyers. And it also talks about a witch, a Hindu witch. I started this book and I'm pretty sure I finished it in 2 days. I think I read half of it one day and the other half the next. It was a really quick read. It was so much fun. This was my very first urban fantasy book that I've ever read, and I absolutely loved it. I flew through it, and I actually bought the next 2 books in the series. This is the Iron Druid Chronicles, in case you didn't know, book 1. So I actually bought the next 2 because I loved it so much. Atticus is funny. He's sarcastic. He is kind of a no-nonsense kind of guy. He's very careful in what he does. I loved all the different characters in it. Everyone has their own little personality. Everyone has their own little quirk. And I'm really excited to see future adventures with him. This was a great surprise read for me. This was definitely 5 stars. And then the last book that I read this month is one that I actually finished today, and that is Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. This book has been all over BookTube, okay? Everyone's talking about it. Everyone loves it. and I can see why. This book is following a young woman named Jules who is really down on her luck. She lost her job, found her boyfriend cheating on her, so now she has nowhere to stay. She's living on the couch of her friend, but she wants to find her own place. She needs a job, and she comes across this ad for being an apartment sitter as a job, and she figures might as well kill two birds with one stone. So she moves into the place, and it's amazing, but there's some certain rules she has to follow that are a little weird, but she goes along with it. But as she stays longer and longer, it seems that things are not quite what they seem. I've heard some people talk about how it has like a ghost aspect to it. Like it feels like it might be a haunted place. I think I even said that in one of my other summaries. I wouldn't say that at all. I would say that this is like strictly thriller, maybe a little mystery, but mostly thriller. It is really spooky in that you don't really know what's going on. What kind of threw me off a little bit, and I understand why, but I wasn't 100% on board about it, is that at the very beginning, we get like a 2-page thing saying what's happening now. At the very beginning of the book, she gets hit by a car. She's running out of the apartment building. She got hit by a car. And like with every section, she is telling the doctor and the nurse like little segments about why she was trying to get out. I almost didn't want that. It like took me out of the environment of what was going on. I felt like the ones in between didn't really add too much to what was going on in the plot. It was just to remind you like, oh, remember she's in the hospital. Oh, remember she got hit by a car. I felt like you could have almost just had it at the beginning, or like maybe one segment at the beginning, and then like I think it's about here-ish is when it catches up to now. Maybe having a big section of the now there. I just wasn't 100% on board with that. It wasn't anything that was necessarily a big twist. Not that I predicted it by any means. I didn't see it coming, but it didn't like knock my socks off either. It was an easy read. This was something that I was able to come home to after a hard day at work, and I knew that I could easily pick this up and read sections of it. So it was a really fast read. It was an easy read, and it was enjoyable for the most part. It's not my favorite book, but I did enjoy the ride. This was a 4-star read for me. And those are the books that I read for February. I am so excited that I've been enjoying all these books, and I also have some big news. I was able to get my library card today. I've been waiting so long, and then I finally realized actually I can actually go get my library card now. So guess what I did today? I went to the library and I picked up some books. So stay tuned for another video on what books I picked up and what I am most likely going to be reading for the coming month. Thanks for being here. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if they sound interesting to you down below. And until next time, see ya.